In the Wild West world of podcasting, there is one podcast that is authentic and genuine and continues to stand tall in its originality. Based on a passion for his guests, their work, and his love of podcasting, Derek Thomas and Monday Morning Critic Podcast get amazing, diverse, unique guests found nowhere else. The variety and quality are endless. There is something for everyone. Derek Thomas is the hero you deserve. He's a silent guardian, a watchful protector. Welcome to Monday Morning Critic Podcast. Here is Derek Thomas.
It's not a drill.
He's got him. Stand up.
You alone out here? My daughters are with me.
Dad?
Let's go.
Can you tell me where you live? In the park?
There's 435 questions. Respond true or false to each question.
Who taught you how to read?
My dad teaches me.
You're actually quite a bit ahead of where you need to be.
I wake up rested and peaceful most mornings.
True.
My day-to-day life is full of things that keep me interested.
True.
I have nightmares or troubling dreams.
Was your dad in the service?
He was.
Do you feel safe living with your dad?
We didn't need to be rescued.
Your dad needs to provide you shelter and a place to live.
He did.
It's not a crime to be unhoused, but it's illegal to live on public land.
We have found an option.
Are we gonna be okay here?
You can still think our own thoughts. Keep pedaling. Look where you want to go.
School is about social skills, not just intellectual ones.
I think it might be easier on us if we try to adapt.
We're wearing their clothes. We're in their house. We're eating their food. We're doing their work. We have adapted.
First of a thousand, right on the wall.
Pack your things.
Did you even try? 'Cause I can't tell.
Somebody said it's unspeakable love to me.
Where's your home?
With my dad.
Lift that burden off of me.
I don't want to leave. Same thing that's wrong with you isn't wrong with me.
Lift that burden off of me.
Where are you guys headed?
I don't think we knew where we were going.
It remains to me.
Pete Rock is an immensely talented writer. His 2009 novel, My Abandonment, was made into Leave No Trace, starring Ben Foster and Thomasin McKenzie. Pete, we finally get a chance to speak. Thank you so much for being here today.
Oh, thank you.
Pete, so born in Salt Lake City, talk to me about what you were like as a kid growing up, right? Because many of your books, and you were so kind enough to send me, I think it was 2 years ago, Night Swimmers, which I absolutely loved. Many of your characters in your books are people that are on the fringe of society, wanderers. I wonder, is that part of your childhood? What kind of kid were you? What kind of talk to me about your life growing up in Utah?
Well, there's the self-mythology, and then there's the truth. I often, I have kids now, so I'm always explaining to them how I was as a kid. I was an amazing soccer player. I was so good. Which is what I tell them. I was a kid who really liked to read. I was living in an environment that I think shaped me a lot, which is to say I was surrounded by Mormons. Mm-hmm. And I wasn't Mormon. And so every kind of typical child activity you might have, whether it was Cub Scouts or basketball, they all took place at the ward house in my neighborhood. So there's a lot of praying. Before uniform inspection, we prayed, and I would be paging through my Cub Scout handbook thinking, where are the prayers? Like, what is this about? I'm kind of a, super privileged white guy. So it's sort of hard to talk about it as sort of being an outsider in any way, because I've had a lot of privileges. And at the same time, I grew up in an environment where I didn't belong and where everyone else seemed to be part of a conversation or part of a series of gatherings that I was not. And so that was both illuminating and frustrating. And, I was bullied in ways that I won't even talk about to you. And I think that it had a strong effect on me in a way because I was surrounded by people who believed that there were invisible forces surrounding us at all times, that there was a real spiritual element to the physical world in a way. And so I think that informed me in certain ways. The landscape informed me in certain ways. And so, that's the beginning of an answer, I guess. It was a very odd place to grow up. It's a super white place to grow up. It was sort of, I feel like a lot of people have this experience of their hometowns where they feel like they have to go back there. That's where they belong. And so I've been both liberated and a little scarred by always feeling like that's not a place I can go back to. That's not a place I belong. And at the same time, when I go back to Salt Lake City and I see the Wasatch Range and I see the silhouette of the Rockies there's something in my body that recognizes it, because that was, the first 17, 18 years of my life spent in that space.
Yeah, and I would imagine it's a place that is, because now Portland, I would believe, is very much unlike Salt Lake in a variety of ways. But what's the biggest that you notice as far as living in Portland? What do you like best about where you are now?
I wonder how different it is in some ways. I was going to reflect, one thing about growing up in Salt Lake is I was surrounded by Mormonism, but I was also surrounded by so many smart people and so many Mormon girls who I desired so much and who who did not like me and whose parents did not like me. So the very first novel I wrote, This Is the Place, it was like the seventh novel I wrote, but the first novel I published is kind of about a Mormon girl who's dissatisfied, and it's about Mormon doctrine in different ways. And I was kind of working through all of that stuff. I think Portland has sort of a diametrically opposed progressive sense of itself. And at the same time, it's about as white as Salt Lake City and probably more now than Salt Lake is. So it's very liberal in some ways, but it's very much about itself in some way, self-mythologizing in certain ways, and was set up as a state, as a city that was kind of whites only. So there are a lot of odd things about Portland, and it's kind of like Austin and Portland have the same bumper sticker, which say, keep Portland weird. And I think it's really dangerous when you conceive of yourself as weird, or you think that that's a positive thing, because I have other friends would say, like, what that really means is keep Portland white, where you are free to, act eccentric and not be suspected. I don't mean to get down on Portland, because I love it here. I love being able to get to the coast. I swim in the river every day. I like getting up in the mountains. It's an easy city to get around. There are many delicious things to eat and drink. So it's a wonderful, wonderful place. But it's also sort of a little bit of, I think, like that show Portlandia is kind of a super exaggeration of what it's like, but it could be a little precious in Portland. So peeling that back a little bit, traveling around on the outskirts and seeing sort of like where the unhoused people are living or how they're living is sort of to be honest about the world we're living in.
That's really well said. And I got thinking when you were talking about the bumper sticker, keep Portland weird. There's a bumper sticker in Massachusetts where a ton of people have it. It's called mass holes, right? Because they're proud and almost like proud of the term, but it's like it's not really an endearing term, but they wear it with pride. But I think the point of it, people don't view everyone from Massachusetts as these, fun-loving people. It's, the way they drive, the way they act. Where I live in Massachusetts, people tend to be very standoffish, very, I don't want to say rude, but maybe rude's next door neighbor. So yeah, I get it. I get what you're saying. But I do want to talk about, speaking of New England, you did attend Yale. What was your experience like, Pete, at Yale? You get your BA in English from Yale. What was your experience like there, and how much do you feel it contributed to you as a writer?
Oh, wow. I would say, I was at Yale for 2 years, and so I went to Deep Springs College, which is in California, just north of Death Valley, which is a very different experience because you're working on a cattle ranch, and back then it was all male, and you couldn't leave. So I was kind of looking for the opposite experience. I've been thinking a lot about Yale because I have really a conflicted sense of the place. I had a great time there. I learned a lot. I had great professors, but I was very much on the periphery. I never, I didn't belong to my college in a way. I never really lived on campus. I didn't have a sense of identity. I didn't want to be part of a community after being at Deep Springs, I think. And I was really, super pretentious. And I think looking back on it, I would have pursued my education in a really different way than I did, because I was trying to read a bunch of literary theory and trying to learn French and doing all of these things. And I think I felt, I'm sounding like a really bitter person in this interview, but I think there was something about me that felt like I don't belong here. There's something evil about it in some way. I think when the Brett Kavanaugh hearings were happening, I was feeling like, oh yeah, I had this really sense of deja vu about that place, as being sort of a terrible place, and when they call me up and ask me for money, I think, why would I do that? And at the same time, wow, I had some great professors. Wow, I met some wonderful people. A place like that does attract students and people who are so smart and so talented. So many of my friends from that time are, now such accomplished and famous and powerful people in different ways. When I was there, I took some writing classes, and I had a writing teacher named Don Faulkner, who passed away a couple years ago, and he was full of wisdom and didn't write a whole lot, and it was he was definitely a peripheral figure in the faculty, but very encouraging to me, which is what I try to be when I'm teaching. And one of my best friends when I was at Yale was Susan Choi, whose book Trust Exercise won the National Book Award last year. And Susan and I had an independent study with Don Faulkner where it pretty much just involved eating Triscuits and drinking beer, while Don gave us advice about sort of what it meant to be an author, what it meant to be a novelist. And so how it affected me as I started to write, I guess I was encouraged. I started writing a novel. I started to feel like it was something that I could do. I also feel like in some ways I painted myself into a corner by talking about what I was going to do, or feeling that being a writer was a kind of identity, which it really isn't. And then after I left Yale, I spent a lot of time working on ranches and then working as a security guard and doing sort of more blue collar work because I didn't really have any skills. And I know, say, my friend Susan now teaches at Yale sometimes, and her students who are great writers, and I have this experience too, where I teach so many people who are so much more talented than I was, and you say to them, what are you going to do? And Susan's students are like, I'm going to go work in banking. She's like, why don't you just work on your writing and get a job like a waitress job? And they're like, no way. So the world has changed in some ways. And that's kind of a digressive answer about Yale. I have I didn't know her at the time, but my wife went to Yale, as did my mother and my sister-in-law and my father-in-law and my brother-in-law, who lives outside of New Haven and works there now. So I still get back there sometimes. But it seems like of all of the eras of my life, that 2 years is sort of the most perplexing to me. Like, what was I doing there? Like, who was I, and what, what came out of it, or what did I take from it? I may never know.
And I have to say, I don't think you're being negative, Pete. I mean, I get that because I do that a lot too. I mean, I'm not Yale, but like I look at my high school, I look at the group of people that I called friends that I grew up with, and there's a part of me that, often thinks about, I wish I did things a bit differently. The high school, the people I hung out with, I felt they weren't healthy. I felt both weren't a healthy place for me. And I mean, at 47, I know that now, but I do think about it. So I don't think you're being very negative. I do have to ask you a little bit in a little bit of a lighter note. New Haven, it is known for their pizza. Do you remember everyone tells me it's the best pizza on the planet. Can you confirm that? Do you remember that? Is it just an awkward question?
It's an awkward question, but I think it depends on what you're looking for.
Okay.
If you're looking for a thin crust pizza, maybe. Maybe Sally's, maybe Pepe's. I think, though, that for people who were at Yale, Demery's is now gone. That was a very kind of bready slice. And then Naples, which is right in the middle of campus, it's kind of a terrible greasy slice, but that's the one that you really remember.
Those late nights, yeah.
That watered down beer and that, it's good.
I think I've had Pepe's before because at Comic Cons they have various vendors, and I think Pepe's was one of them. But is Pepe's the leader there, you think, Pete?
I can't really speak to it. I don't know. But I think you can't go too wrong.
And the other thing I've been dying to ask you about, right? So you and I have talked for a while, and you mentioned beer. Are you an IPA guy? Are you darker beer? What is your preference as it goes to beer?
Oh, it kind of depends on the season. But I am an IPA guy, but then it's just so powerful. But there's so many great beers in Portland. That's another good thing about Portland. So right now I'm drinking the Optimist, which is an IPA made by Fort George, which is in Astoria. I will drink them, but I have suspicions of the hazy IPA. I like a kind of straightforward, strong IPA. I don't like too much kind of fruitiness. So what's your feeling?
I got to tell you, I'm a big. I like Polish beer that they sell around here, which is, I guess you could compare it to Heineken, but it's not skunky and it's much better. But it's the only beer. My problem, Pete, is that once I have one, they're so delicious. I want another one and then another one. Hence the expanded waistline. So I mean, I have a love relationship with beer.
It's delicious.
Yeah, it is
delicious.
It is delicious. And, I did want to, getting back on track here, and I'm sorry to go off track, but I was dying to ask you those two questions. You do teach creative writing at Reed College. What is the most difficult part of that, Pete? You mentioned many of your students are very talented. They're great writers. What is the challenge for you as a teacher of especially creative writing, right? What's the challenge there for you? And I'm sure there's not just one, but what is one that you feel, if you want to tell me more than one, that's fine too, but is there one that kind of reappears more than the others?
Challenges are many. I think having been doing it for 25 years or so, I feel like the challenge is patience in some ways, and the challenge is that I always underestimate how emotionally exhausting it is, because I believe a person who writes will find their way if they're persistent about it. And I feel like a writing class or a writing teacher, the best thing they can do is pay close attention and ask questions and react to it. I don't think there's a right answer to anything. But to be honest and to be present and to really show a work respect, that is really tiring, more tiring all the time. I mean, in kind of new age speak, like every challenge is an opportunity. So it's sort of, I used to teach a little bit more in grad school, or I taught at conferences, or I taught people who were really focused on a more pre-professional take on writing and sort of publishing and what would happen next. And I like teaching undergraduates because they still want to talk about that sometimes, but it's mostly just about storytelling, which interests me. And a lot of them are not even that interested in, as I kind of suggested before, in sort of pursuing it that long or that hard, or maybe they'll continue on in their life, but they're scientists, they're doing something else. But this question of how we are experiencing our lives on this earth and how we use language to try to communicate how we feel and how to make that specific to an individual is a skill and a talent and a struggle that we're all going through. And it's like, wow, what an opportunity to try to help someone figure that out and how to figure out how to communicate who they are, communicate where they're coming from, communicate their emotions. I think is sort of the challenge, is the big challenge. And the specifics of that are different with every person. They're different with every story. They're different with every essay. So sort of one danger of being at my stage where, I'm about to turn 54, I've been doing it a long time, I probably will retire, is I can be a pretty smart person reading stories, and I can say the same thing over and over again. So trying to not do that, or trying to be aware of my sensibility, or trying to figure out new ways forward is a challenge. And I think that I take breaks from teaching and I try to remind myself, what I'm doing or why I'm writing. I felt like last year I'd taken a break from teaching, and I came back and I was teaching from this basement. I was teaching on Zoom often, 5-6 hours a day. I was down here talking, and it took away a lot of my traditional weapons. It took away my charisma in some ways. It took away my creepy ability to reach out and touch people. I'm just kidding. But it was a good challenge to sort of like try to tone it down a little bit. I think, my dream as a writer or as a teacher is to, have a number of people who've worked with me whose work doesn't resemble each other's in any way, where my fingerprints aren't on anyone's work, that no one can say, oh, they worked with Pete Rock. It's clear. So the goal is to sort of, anytime you're teaching someone, is to help them make their writing more like itself.
Do you feel, Pete, that because you are a successful author, that students tend to invest more of themselves into your class or into you? Do you feel that plays a big part of it, or a part of it?
I would love that if it were the case. Both, I would love to be a successful author, and also I would love for my students to be. No, actually, I don't really care. They're totally unaware of anything that I write, and very few of them read anything that I write, and so they have no sense of that whatsoever. They're much more interested in their own work. So no, that doesn't really come into play in a way, I think.
See, if you're taking, in my opinion, if you're taking a creative writing class, I would know my professor. I would just dot my I's, cross all my T's, and make sure that I think those that really want to pursue writing as a passion, to me, it seemed like to have you in that scenario would be very ideal, but that's the way I see it. Looking out, you mentioned your friend from Yale who's a teacher, and she sees these very talented kids who want to go into other fields. Have you ever had a student where you've seen the same thing, the talent, and you encourage them, listen, you need to pursue writing. You're a gifted writer. You're a great writer. Does that scenario happen a lot, Pete?
I think so. I think it more often is the other direction, where like you've got to figure out a way. And I definitely was fortunate in my family and my situation in a million ways. And I sometimes feel like, throughout this time when I talk about my path writing things, I've often tried to spin it in a certain way that, I worked really hard, and I was really talented and things worked out, which is one way to talk about it. But in truth, there were so many things pushing me along. There were so many ways in which I had advantages that if I were less successful than I am now, that would be really embarrassing. I think that one thing that you can't estimate is how much better people can get. Sometimes I'll deal with students who are really talented, who continue to write the same kinds of story over and over again. They don't get a lot better. And then some people, it's so much of it is about persistence, and so much of it is about reading a lot, and so much of it is about trying new things. So some of my students who have gone on and published and had great success, I'm delighted. But if you would have asked me at the very beginning if that would have happened, I would be surprised maybe. So I think it's hard to predict because it's also so tied into the vicissitudes of the publishing world and what gets attention when, and sort of all kinds of different luck and different, things that are happening in the atmosphere. So I don't know. It's easy for me to say to people, if you want to work on writing things and you want to pay attention to the world and language in this way, it's going to make your life more interesting. But quantifying success is something that is pretty dangerous. And thinking about it as a career, which sometimes students will talk, it's not a career like that. I think one reason I hesitate to talk about it too much or to teach, I think, my experience of writing things was much cleaner and much more pure, I think, when I had different sorts of jobs, when I wasn't talking about technical questions, when I wasn't talking about my own writing, when I was just writing things. So I guess I'm always trying to encourage people to, continue to write, but to disengage their sense of worth or the worth of their writing from the response that they get or their ability to publish things or whatever.
And is that the same way the philosophy you have with your students? And I know you have 2 children. Is that the same way you've taught them the importance of writing as they've grown older? Or is it kind of like, what, if they want to write, they can come to me. I'd be more than happy to tell them. How do you approach? And I ask this question because I have my own, a daughter just turned 1, so she's a bit away from writing.
Mm-hmm.
But how do you, what's your approach, if you don't mind me asking this, with your own children?
Oh, there's is so obvious, but so interesting in some ways to consider teaching and parenting as similar sorts of activities. And I think one of the pleasures of growing older is sort of recognizing, and you hear this a little bit when I'm talking about my students, it used to be I just wanted everyone to pursue their dreams, but now I'm a parent and I'm just like, wow, someone is paying for this dream somewhere down the line. Mm-hmm. So I feel more worried about them as a parent. It's sort of when you read or teach the same stories over and over again, you identify with different characters. You identify with the children at some point. Like if you read Hemingway, and then eventually you're just like, you turn a corner and you're just like, wow, this character is a child. Like this character is a jerk. Like what's going on with this? And it's sort of, to answer your question, I have no control over my children. I don't know what they're doing. The main thing is, they like to read. I don't have a desire for them to become storytellers necessarily, but I love, reading to them and talking to them about the things that we read. I was just traveling with my 14-year-old and we were listening to various Boxcar Children books, which I had read to her when she was really, really young. And so we were kind of revisiting Gertrude Chandler Warner. And and just amazing, details of how much food description there is so great. And sort of talking about, Laura Ingalls Wilder and sort of the amazing descriptions there. So, I mean, you'll hopefully get there. But like, there's nothing in my life that's been more sort of, it's such a cliche, but it's so amazing to see my kids read, and to sort of, get really into a book, and of course we read to them a lot, but, when they started sort of just, reading all the time, or like you go on a walk with them and they'd be carrying a book and reading as they walked, sort of, is so encouraging. And so, I don't really have expectations of them. I just sort of, try to encourage them while they insult me.
Before I ask you my next question, I did want to go back to something you said earlier, which I should not have skipped over. I should have asked you about. You mentioned at Deep Springs that you did work on a ranch. Do I have that right? Mm-hmm. So right. Tell me a little bit about that.
I think, one way to kind of sum up the Deep Springs college world is just you're constantly put in situations where you're not qualified to deal with them. And so it's a school that's in a desert valley. Back then, it was about 12 students a year. It's free for everyone. And you work on the ranch, which isn't to suggest the ranch makes money, because it doesn't. And when I was there, it was very run down. But it did allow me to make some connections and build some small skills, which translated into me working more years later in Montana on ranches. And I'm actually driving out this weekend to the same ranch where I worked, and my daughter's going to go nanny for one of the grandchildren of the person I worked for. So I still am connected with all these people. But at Deep Springs, it was sort of, I was in charge of, it's also a very student government kind of student-run place. I was the chair of the admissions committee, applications committee, and so we spent a lot of time interviewing the incoming students and talking to parents and that kind of thing, and just working on a lot of machinery that no one who knew what they were doing had ever worked on. So you'd study the schematics of a boiler, and then you'd take it apart, and it would be held together with baling wire.
Wow.
So it's, since I was there, which was the late 80s, it's totally in better shape. Like I went back and taught there around 2000, and a lot of the buildings have been rebuilt. And now, fortunately, it's co-ed. It still is very similar, but it also really informed everything that I did after that time. When I left Utah, I went to Deep Springs, and I was coming from this very suburban skater life, into this cowboy world, where everyone I knew seemed to have already read Marx and Hume and Descartes and everything, and I had never dealt with any of that. So that was sort of that's definitely, like, that 2 years I can account for in a different sort of way than the 2 years I can account for at Yale.
Pete, let me ask you. So in lieu of tuition, the work on the ranch is how you compensate for the tuition. Is that basically how that works? Am I reading that correctly?
No. It's sort of, the founder of Deep Springs LL Nunn in 1917, he had this idea that your education should be physical as well as intellectual.
Okay.
And so it's part of your education, and there are definitely things that need to be handled on the ranch. But as I said, the ranch might break even. So it's all kind of about the endowment, which is a separate question. But it's certainly not as if you're making money that's paying for your education.
I got you. So, and let me ask you my last question about this. I'm not somebody that sees meaning in everything, but is there anything that you take or that you took away from your work on a ranch, whether it's there or Montana, that you've applied as an author, as far as maybe it's a work ethic, maybe it's something about determination, maybe it's something much more specific than that? Is there anything you took out of working on a ranch that you've brought into your writing?
I don't know. That question sort of suggests that I have insight that I don't quite have into my life. But I think, stepping back, I might say I think it's true of life too. It's definitely true of parenting, and it's true of writing through time, a lot of different projects. I've been in a lot of situations where I've been completely overwhelmed, and where I've been completely sort of humiliated and felt as if I was just not qualified or just couldn't figure out a way forward. And I'm still here. And so I feel like in terms of writing, and I see this with student work too, but I see it in my work, when at our best, we write ourselves into situations where we haven't been there before, where we don't know what's going to happen next, and where we're really confused. And I do my best work, I think, when I'm pretty confused. But as in life, our reaction to confusion usually is to try to simplify things, or to try to turn it into something we've seen before, or to try to do something we've done before. And so being aware of that, and sort of, being aware of sort of just being in this turbulence for a period of time, and knowing like, I've just got to stay here in this confusion longer, that I'll find my way out eventually. I just don't want to try to like simplify it too fast. So, that's, I guess, one lesson I've learned, I was like, never a great ranch hand, by any stretch of the imagination. So sort of, but it also just sort of made me aware of, I love animals. I love being outside. I like building fences. I like waking up really early. All those things are still true.
No, that's great. As an author, is it tough to put yourself out there? I mean, how much to what the people say about your books that, whether the critique is positive or negative, do you invest any time in any of that? And how difficult is it to put yourself out there? Because in a sense, you put so much time into your books. I mean, do you take what people say? Are you aware of that? Or is it, you're doing something you love? If they like it, fine. If not, you're going to still pursue and keep doing what you love doing.
Well, I mean, it is just kind of humiliating. But I think increasingly, like, I published my first book in 1997. And that was kind of before Amazon, before the internet. And increasingly, the author's job becomes self-promotion, or the identity of the author becomes a kind of important parallel to the work that is happening. And trying to figure out how to modulate that is something some authors can do well. I think, the reason that I write, the pleasure that I get out of it is disappearing and not being aware of myself. Which is another reason why I gave you such a hard time about interviewing, because I don't think of myself as an author. I think of myself as a person, and sometimes I write, but I don't. It's pretty unconscious a lot of that time. The editing, maybe not. To answer your question more specifically, I don't read any reviews. I've never read any reviews. I don't don't ever look online at anything anyone says. I don't really care. I do care that people, I do actually want people to read the things that I write, because I spend a lot of time on them and I love to read. So I'm hoping that I'm doing something that is entertaining to people. And the way that I get feedback, I guess, is just, I hear from people, which is sweet, from individuals. I know from traveling through various publishers and like dealing with my agent or whatever, when things are going relatively well, and usually they're not, so I think it's important for people who want to write, or who are thinking about it as a potential career, or thinking that it could be a career, that it's really, for most people, a hard thing to sustain. So my 11th book is coming out in March. And I sold it for the exact same 5 figures that I sold my first book for. And in that period of time, I have made a film and had success in various things, but it's not so much about, it's not like I'm in the exact same place. It's that the market has changed. It's just like it's not a commercial enterprise in a way that people think. It's also true that if you have a sales record or if you have published a number of books, like you can't be discovered again, which is fine. So I'm always hoping that I can. I mean, I've written a lot of things that are sort of confounding, that are just not commercial works. And so I'm aware of that too. And one thing about being a tenured professor, or one thing about having a spouse who's a physician, is I can write what I want. And so I do. And I think there was a time in my life when I put a lot of pressure on making money, or like pressure on my work to make money. And I believed that that was a possibility for me, but it changed my relationship to the work in a fundamental way where, you know, I would sit down and I would have a million voices in my head about what I should be doing, or what was wrong with what I had done before, or what kinds of things might appeal to people or people might like. And I think when I'm reading something and I get the sense that the author loved writing it, or that there's just a lot of positive emotion in it, that comes through. So, you know, I don't really think about other people. I think about the characters in my book. I think about the world of the book, and I just try to stay in there as long as I can.
Yeah, and before I wanted to end the interview by diving in a little bit to My Abandonment, but before that, you mentioned March 2022, I believe, is the release of your book. What can you tell me about the title, what the book is about? Whatever you could say, I'd love to hear.
It's kind of terrifying. Like sometimes, I don't know about you, like I write something and I feel like, what is wrong with me? Like, where did this come from? I'm not sure. The title is Passers Through. It's a book that takes place here in Portland. It's about an elderly man and his relationship with his daughter, and his relationship with a woman he meets on the street after he's bitten by a dog. I think a lot of the things that I write, or most people write, are sort of reactions to the experience of writing the thing before. When I wrote The Night Swimmers, which is a pretty autobiographical book, much more than anything else I'd written, and involved a lot of parts of my life and involved all kinds of disparate sorts of information, whether they be letters from the past or, you know, photographs, all kinds of things. I just wanted to try to write a book that was in the third person, that was the best story that I could tell. And it's definitely mixed up with some of the terrors of the pandemic, although doesn't relate to that in any explicit way. It's definitely about the living and the dead. You know, it's kind of not explicitly about the experience of having my dad die, but I can see, as I think I can often see in retrospect when I write something, oh, this is what this is about. Like, this is what I was kind of traveling through during this time. So the book is called Passers Through. It's a short novel. I think it's kind of the most coherent thing that I've written and the scariest thing. But I have kind of an ill feeling about it.
No, it sounds like a really great premise. You know, and it gets me thinking, you know, we talk about, or, you know, I was going into Leave No Trace and My Abandonment today. How difficult is it to take, you know, something that's near and dear to you and watch somebody else make it as their vision, right? I know you were quoted at one point as saying a lot of things they did were frustrating and mystery to you. I guess it's a two-part question. One, how difficult is it? And two, and if you feel comfortable sharing, if you don't, that's fine. Two, what was frustrating for you in that process?
Well, now that I've drunk my beer, I'm going to just answer you honestly.
Okay.
It's tough. I mean, it's sort of part of it, like the backstory here is like anytime anyone gives you money and attaches a lot of talented people to react to something that you made and make something else that is beautiful, if you start complaining about it, there's something really, really wrong with you. So that said, it's not an experience I'd had before. Like, I'd been through various levels of things being in development before. I'd adapted other things for other people for films that didn't get made. I think over the years, if you asked me a year ago or 2 years ago, my reaction would be a little different. Maybe. I think that all creation of a creative kind is a reaction to something, is a reaction to something that's happening in the world. And seeing how I operate, I'm always curious to put myself in a situation where the things that come out of me are surprising, that they're not strategic, that sort of is exciting to me. So when I wrote My Abandonment, of course, I was responding to a real story that I'd read about in the newspaper. So I was already reacting to the story of the father and daughter who were found living in Forest Park, not far from me, who lived there for 3 years and who were relocated and who disappeared. And so when Debra Granik, the director and the screenwriter, when she started working on the screenplay, she and I went to Forest Park and we walked around and saw where the people were living and various other things. We had a lot of conversations, and we had conversations about the story and what I thought was important and things that might change. And so I was familiar with that. I was comfortable with that. It was amazing to see sort of actually how a film gets made as a storyteller. To see the sheer number of people on a small film, whether it's the drone pilot or the makeup people or the sound people or the cameramen, like all the grips, it's sort of, you recognize that when you're writing a story, all of these things are internalized. Like, you're having to worry about the light, you're having to worry about the setting, you're having to worry about, how, what people's expressions are and how the dialogue works. It's kind of amazing and wonderful to see that. And it was also sort of a process of letting go. So when I was on the set, I watched for the morning and I saw Debra at lunch, and she was, a very particular character. And she said, well, there's not much happening this afternoon. So you might, and I was like, well, I've been here all morning. And she was like, really? And I said, yeah, and I have several things I need to tell you. I have some real feedback, some ideas. And I just saw her face turn to stone. I was like, I'm just kidding. I don't have, like, it was her thing, which is great. It's sort of, there are big changes in plot, as you know. And I think there are ways in which the novel is a hard thing to account for in a film, in a straight film without a whole lot of voiceover or retrospective action, which would be terrible. And I love so much both Ben Foster and Thomason. And so I really appreciated the work that they did. I thought the acting in the film was great. I think it's hard to, I think a fundamental problem for me is feeling like I should get attention, which I think is probably just that I was parented really well. And so one thing that I've sort of tried to de-escalate within myself is the feeling like I should be getting more attention than I am. So it's hard to see something like that, which sort of wouldn't exist without my book, and to see how in the marketing of it or how the putting together of it, that it was never mentioned really. And I think, I went to Sundance and I was excited because it was in Utah, and I'd been to Sundance growing up and it was sort of my homecoming. And I, kind of couldn't find the film because the film's title had been changed and it didn't really have a title for a little while. And I, of course, had all these windbreakers and all this equipment that said My Abandonment on it. And really the place I was supposed to, I think, make money was, and in some ways, like maybe that played out a little bit, but it was just sort of like the tie-ins to the novel. But the simple things like the changing of my protagonist's name or the title of the film, those things were never discussed with me. And to be honest, there's no reason why they would be discussed with me, because it would be a really unpleasant discussion. But those things hurt. And I guess I wouldn't have it any other way. Like, I don't write anything where I don't really care about it. So, it's okay. I mean, another book of mine, Klickitat, is in development now. And I think it's even sort of harder for me because the short answer is I don't think I will ever work on, like, sell another option to a book of mine where I'm not involved in writing the script, or I don't have a little bit more connection to it. And I think that the really wise, sane answer that many authors say is, take the money and don't look back and don't ever pay attention to it. And I think if the money was really good, which it wasn't, like, maybe, but I think I would rather be a little bit more involved, and it's just sort of my own attachment issues to things that I make, I guess. So it's a big question, but as I talk about it and as I think about it, I just sound kind of like a baby. I think that this is the best case scenario, that really talented people take your work and they make the thing that they're going to make with it. And I think being on set and seeing how Debra operated, and sort of even recognizing the super hyper-focused way that she operated and say, like, didn't involve me or didn't ask me questions, it's kind of necessary. I don't think there are a whole lot of directors where, great directors who everyone is like, wow, they're so collaborative. Like, it's just like, it's a lot of people and it's a lot of things to keep track of, and it's a real focus. So I totally admire that at the same time as it was hard for me.
Yeah, that's such a great answer. And I would think it would be abnormal to not feel like, I think it's normal to feel the way you do, because it's something you put your heart into. Of course you're going to want to know. I think the positive here, though, is it's just such a wonderful story, both the book and in different ways, the book and the movie. The movie, having a daughter, is even that much more powerful for me. Just a couple quick questions on the story itself. The story is you talked about it, and I've been wondering, I've been dying to ask you this, Pete, for a while. The father does live he's a veteran, potentially PTSD, or I think he definitely is PTSD. I'm not sure about how certain that is. And they've been living in the woods for a long period of time, the father and his 13-year-old daughter. They're eventually taken out and put on I want to say it's a ranch. But Pete, who is it to decide that these people need help, right? So if they're, and maybe I'm looking too far into it, right? What's wrong with being off the grid? What's wrong with deciding what's best for you and your daughter? I don't know. I just feel like the actual true part of this, that did happen. I don't know. Am I being overly skeptical? Am I being too hard on that? Is there any credence to what I'm saying?
Well, certainly. I think it sort of, in a way, circles back to what we were talking about before with regard to Portland. I was writing a different book, The Bewildered. And in The Bewildered, it's a long story. I won't recount it, but there are parts of that book that happen in Forest Park, and there are parts of My Abandonment where Caroline, the narrator, is watching things that happen in The Bewildered, like the two kids on top of the water tank. And when I was writing that book, I was reading the newspaper articles about this father and daughter, and I felt like maybe I'll try to include this. And this character she didn't really have anything to do in that book except observe, and she was way too interesting. So I took her out, but I was following the story of sort of that they'd been located, that they'd been relocated on this horse farm, that they'd been, and then that they disappeared. And I was waiting to hear the story of what happened to them, and it didn't come. And so as a fiction writer, I began to try to imagine writing it. But the twin sort of reactions to the actual story, which fascinated me, were, first of all, sort of related to what you're saying, a kind of appreciation for what they were doing. And in sort of a liberal, self-lacerating way, like these people gave up this super materialistic world that we live in, and they were doing so well, and she was testing beyond where she should have been in school. You know, who are we to say that they should, you know, to live differently? Like they were, it's such a judgment on the world we live in and the way that we are living that, you know, and then the flip side of that reaction was almost immediately like, however, they would be much happier and they'd be better off if they lived like the rest of us do. And so let's relocate them and put her in school. And, you know, it's a more complicated story, of course, in the world than in my book. But I think that I was curious about that. I was curious about like the inability to make a shift or to adapt in that way was curious to me, but also just sort of my own reaction to the story and the reaction of people in Portland, which I saw as being sort of a paradox of celebrating them and trying to change them simultaneously.
Yeah, and I really love the way the narrative is driven, that the narration works in your book. I really think that's just such a wonderful thing. You know, is there a part of the movie that maybe wasn't in the book or may have been in the book that you really loved and stuck with you?
I guess I would say two things. I think the movie is like beautifully shot. I think it's just beautiful to see those big trees, and to see it on a big screen was really worthy. There's so little of the dialogue of the novel in the film that when it comes up, I'm so excited. There's a discussion, and in a way, I mean, I don't mean to sound critical, but in a way, I think that there was so little script. I think that that they shot it chronologically, which I think is kind of rare, but it allowed them to digress and allowed them to move further and further and further away from the script as they went, and kind of react to what the actors were doing, react to what the weather was doing, react to where they were. So it just sort of started to drift. Like the first half hour, 20 minutes of that film is much closer to the book than anything else. And I just love it because it's so beautiful. And there's a conversation that the father and daughter have about their favorite color, which is from the book. And when I was working on the book, as I often do, I wasn't really thinking about plot, but I was spending a lot of time just writing conversations to see how these two people talk to each other, to see what the energy was between them or what the emotions were. So I felt like that may not have, you know, worked for everyone else in the same way, but when that little scene about when they're in the tent and they're talking about their favorite colors is so rich for me. And then there are other parts. I think there are ways in which, for me, I'll say, the Debra and the film crew got a little bit Portlandian. Like they just got, like, they brought in all this stuff that it seemed like not really authentic to this world that I know, but was just sort of like extreme exaggerated versions of what happens in Portland. So there's like some parts of that were just like, wow, like where did this come from? Like someone said this was interesting and you decided to include it. But there are other parts that are not in the book. Like I'd say the whole focus on like future farmers of America, or for like just the rabbits. One thing I didn't talk about in my childhood, which could take up a whole other interview, is just sort of my rabbit raising. I loved growing up. I loved raising rabbits, and I just love animals anyway. But the part of the film that's kind of about the rabbits, and it sort of has nothing to do with the book, but I really like that section because it doesn't seem it generates an emotion, it generates an atmosphere, but it's not generating sort of a lesson, or it's not generating plot in a way. It sort of felt like a natural resonance with things that I feel about the world. So I really like that part too.
No, great answers. And I have 2 questions left for you. I really felt that this story does to PTSD what Good Will Hunting did to bipolar disorder. I'm a really big fan of the book and the movie. I really think they're both very successful in somewhat different ways. And I love the fact that there's the honesty that some things can't be fixed. I've heard you talk about this before, Pete. What do you think actually happened to them? I mean, because for those listening who aren't familiar with the entire story, they are taken out of the woods, they're on the ranch, and then they kind of just disappear. What do you think happened, Pete? Has that thought evolved in your mind over the years, or do you kind of have a feeling that you know? And if you want to answer this, you don't have to answer this obviously either. But I'm just curious to know if you have an opinion on that.
I also really like that part. I was thinking when Ben Foster is answering those questions at the computer, and he's kind of failing to answer them. Really, I thought he was so great in that film. Just love him. I think that's a hard question for me because it's like a lot of fiction, especially fiction that's generated out of real stories. There's something just fundamentally ethically wrong about spinning a story out of someone's life and hypothesizing about it. And from the beginning, this wasn't a book that I was thinking about. It was something I wanted to try. I wasn't necessarily thinking about publishing it. And I clearly did publish it. And right away when I read from the book, people got angry and talked about how I had, stolen this girl's voice and how I was telling a story that wasn't mine to tell. And I think those are pretty fair criticisms. And yet I still did it. And I hope that my appreciation and wonder about the situation is evident, and my respect for the people is evident. And part of my hesitation is just, the book brought attention to people who did not want attention, or raised questions about where they were, who they were, what was going on, which is part of the deal, but which is something I don't feel great about. And initially when I wrote the book, a lot of people contacted me and told me where these people were and what was going on. And there were 20 different answers. They're just like, and I was so happy because the first time someone told me this, I felt so shaken. And then as the other answers started coming in, I started realizing like they're being successful at sort of avoiding an easy answer to this. And, I think over the years, I learned a little bit more, and I recognize sort of my place in this overall story. And so my hope is, of course, that everyone is happy. Of course, this girl at this point is a woman, is, in her 20s. That relationship is one that, like all of our relationships with children, changes through time. And one of the, if not in real life, certainly in the book, one of the timelines or one of the things that's forcing the drama is just like she's getting older, like she's not going to listen in the same way. She's becoming a woman. And so as they moved out of sort of their world, which the father could control so much more, and as she became older, as she began questioning him, as he started becoming more unhinged, I think things did have to change. And so I don't have like a strong answer that I would give you. I would hope that in some ways it's such a clearly such a rich story, and people come back to it. And a number of authors that I know, said, that was my story. Like, I can't believe that you wrote it. Like I was going to write that. And I think there are a couple other books that are kind of inspired by the same story. But my hope would be, as I said before, that, if inspiration is a kind of reaction, that I was reacting to this real story and the film was also reacting to the real story as it reacted to my book. I would love there to be a corrective at some point, for there to be, non-fictional account, or for, some of these answers to to be answered. And I'm not the person to do that. But to try to, be respectful and to stay out of the way, I guess, is what I hope to do.
I think one of the things I really love, Pete, and this will be the last thing I say, is I love the relationship and rapport in both the book and the movie and how it does change over time, right? I mean, in life and in the book, in this movie, it's just, that's the one part of parenthood that I'm looking forward to most, is how that relationship changed, actually going through that. So that's kind of the real powerful part of this entire story that I'm completely in love with. And I'm also very happy, Pete, that they didn't go insane with the ending. And I love the way Ben Foster just kind of goes back to being what he knows. And I thought that was a classy way to end it and not go over the top.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I guess, you're in it now, so you'll find out about the parenthood. I feel like when I look at this book now, I always see it as just like my anxiety of being a father, like having a daughter. And I was just finishing this book right before my first daughter was born. And so I knew I was having a daughter. I knew she was coming. And this kind of anxiety about, like, kind of in a basic way, like, who am I? Like, what kind of advice do I have to give? Like, how can I represent this world? How can I help someone through it? Which are just really portentous and kind of pretentious questions to ask. And they're not things I think that we're conscious of all the time. But it is especially as, the world burns up and we live in anarchy, it sort of is even more anxiety provoking. But that relationship, I think, and also, it's again, like, I made this gesture toward a similarity in teaching writing and parenting. It's sort of, at some point, it is a question of sort of trusting people's independence and sort of respecting them and trying to react as much as anything and not to sort of dictate the terms of how they're going to tell their story.
No, that's really well said. Pete, you've given me so much of your time. I'm a huge fan, and I'll continue to do so. And I'm excited for March of 2022. I can't thank you enough, man. Thank you for sticking with me. And I there aren't many people who would have, stuck with me as long as you did. And I really appreciate your kindness. And I had a lot of fun talking to you, Pete.
You're welcome. Thank you so much for your attention, and take care.